Hey guys, how's it going? It's Krista here and welcome to the tutorial of a special thank you for a special person. I'll start off today with Spellbinder's Be Bold Blooms die set and a piece of watercolor paper. I wasn't exactly sure which pieces of this die set that I would be utilizing, so I ran the whole set through the die cut machine on watercolor paper, and anything that I don't use I can save for another project. To add color to these die cuts, I'm using watercolor paints by Holbein. I'm starting off with leaf green, olive green, sap green, and Indian red, just to get a variety of colors of greens and a green with a little bit of yellow and a little bit of red for a brown to add variation that I would find normally in nature. And for the broader leaves, I'm making sure that I'm using a paint with a thinner consistency, a paint that has a little bit more water, just so that I can get that pigment down into the score lines of the die cut. Each time that I start a different leaf, I'm making sure to start with a different green. Sometimes I'll start with one that I mix up, sometimes a lighter green, sometimes a darker, just to have that variation so that my end product doesn't seem so flat and monotone. For the first biggest bloom, I'm using Magenta by Holbein and bringing in a little bit of violet for the edges. Again, making sure that I have a very thin consistency, one that's very watery, so I can make sure to get pigment into the score lines within the die cut. For the second large flower, I'm using Phthalo Blue by Holbein, and I mix that with Viridian Hue. For the outer edges of the flower, I brought the violet back in just so that there was some consistency between the flowers. On this piece of 110-pound cardstock, I'm just marking where the outside of this rectangle is. I know that I'll be cutting down my background with this die, so I want to make sure that my background is colored up to the point of where the die is going to be. And using peacock feathers and distress oxide ink, I'm just coloring a solid background with a blending tool. I want to make sure that my background is nice and saturated. You don't have to have a background that's as saturated as the one I'm making today. You could also bring in different colors if you wanted. And before I run that through my die cut machine, I just want to make sure that that ink is really nice and set. The oxides take a little bit longer to dry on cardstock than the dye inks do. Then I'll just run that through my die cut machine once that's nice and dry. And since Distress Oxide ink does react with water, to get that little bit of variation in my inked background, I sprayed it with a little bit of water before setting it with the heat tool. In the end, I know that I want my note card to sit in a 5.5 by 4.25 inch note card base, and then I want my band with my sentiment to go across the entire card. So again, with a pencil, I just marked where the die falls. I chose today to use Thank You from Simon Hurley Sentimental Flowers stamp set. I'm using my die background to find the placement because ultimately this band will sit on top of the dyed portion of the background. So I'm using that on top of the paper I plan to emboss to find the placement of my thank you sentiment. And after finding where I want the sentiment to sit on the inked background, I can simply remove it and prep my 110-pound cardstock for embossing. After I've prepped my cardstock, I'll just come in with some Versamark ink to ink up my stamp. For embossing powder today, I'm using Detailed Gold embossing powder by Recollections. And set with a heat tool. So I know that I want my band to be about as thick as my sentiment. The issue is I don't have a die to create that kind of shape, and the loop in the Y hangs down. So to cut it to the shape that I want, I'll use my paper trimmer just to cut it down, and then scissors to fussy cut around the loop in the Y. For the mat of the card front, I used 2 dies to create a frame. One was from Lawn Fawn Large Stitched Rectangle Stackable Set. The inner frame was from Lawn Fawn Outside In Stitched Rectangle Stackable Dies. Once that was cut out, I adhered that down with Tombow liquid adhesive. And before I could start arranging my flowers, I had to find the placement of my sentiment strip. And to find the placement and to ensure that it was straight, I lined up the bottom of my card front with a line on my glass mat. I lined up the edge of the sentiment strip with a line on my glass mat before taping one side of the strip down. I chose not to adhere both sides down because I wanted the option to tuck some flowers and other elements behind the sentiment strip later on. I started with the 2 large flowers because I knew that I wanted them to be the focal point of this arrangement. I then fussed around with the leaves and the other elements until I was happy with them. The rule that I tried to follow was that it was equal both on left and right sides, with some exceptions. I chose to place the stem in the top left-hand corner because I wanted something to grab your eye and pull it down to the center. And once I was happy with the arrangement, I just came in with some Tombow liquid adhesive and glued that down. For the instances where I wanted to have a flower appear that it was in the back but couldn't tuck it behind because I'd already glued flowers down, I simply cut down the stem to where I could hide it behind an already glued element. And once I'd finished all my flower arranging, I taped down the other side of the sentiment strip. As a finishing touch, I added 2 butterflies. These butterflies are ones that I made in a previous video, and these 2 butterflies happen to be my favorite butterflies just because they have a little bit of gold alloy running through them. I'll link the video up top in case you want to check it out. And the last thing to do is adhere our card front to a card base. And in case you were curious, this card is being mailed to a family member who gifted me not only my watercolor paints for Christmas, but the Be Bold Blooms set as well. I thought it was a fitting thank you for such a lovely gift. Here's a final look at the finished card. Thank you so much for stopping by. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.